the Ukrainians clearly are violating it and doing so deliberately. I mean, there was some question in my mind early on whether or not it was deliberate, because first, okay, Putin had agreed to it. The Russians said they even shot down their own drones to honor the ceasefire. But Zelensky went ahead and struck, another piece of energy infrastructure on Russian land. And then, but, he had not verbally agreed to it at that point. But then he did. And after he did, following a phone call, or it was actually during a phone call with Trump, I believe, the Ukrainians struck the Suja metering station and did extensive damage there. Now, okay, again, this happened immediately afterwards. Maybe it was a rogue element. That's a thought that was out there and a thought that I had myself. But since then, it's just been constant. It's been intensifying. And according to the Russians, in the last 24 hours, there have been 3 attacks on energy infrastructure. That just cannot be a rogue element, a mistake. It's a deliberate effort to subvert this agreement. And I find that extraordinary because, again, it seems like there's an inability on the part of the Ukrainians to be flexible even when it's in their own interest. They might feel that this agreement is not helpful to them. I don't see that it really is. It probably is helpful because, again, the Russians can do a lot more damage and have done a lot more damage. And maybe the only argument you can make is that the Russians have done so much damage to the Ukrainian infrastructure that there's not a whole lot left to hit. And so they feel like, okay, well, they already blew it up, so what does it matter? But there still is, there is that remaining 20% or something that the Russians could take out. But they're just inflexible. It's clear that this is going to damage the relationship, or it should anyway. If the Americans are at all sincere about this effort to, reach a ceasefire and eventually a settlement, the Americans have to be very angry about this. I think there's no question about it. And this has got to be putting, a real strain on the Ukraine-U.S. relationship. But the Ukrainians are doing it. Again, this is the guy, Zelensky, who has right outside of his office, that big painting of the Kremlin in flames. I think we're just seeing Ukraine right here. It's almost like a death cult, incapable of compromise. It's just like, we've just got to keep on killing Russians until the very end. I don't know how to explain it because it does not seem to me to be at all in the interest of the Ukrainians. They could be, they could make a very, very minor concession. It really isn't any concession to speak of. And in that way, maintain a good relationship with the Americans. But the Americans, you would hope anyway, that they have to understand what's going on. They have to see that it is the Ukrainians that are violating it. And so I think the Russians themselves have not responded, though they have reserved the right to respond to these attacks. Obviously they would have the right to do it. The one side is violating it. They're keeping their side. And there are apparently a lot of Russians, of the kind of the more nationalist bent within Russia. They're quite upset about this. But I think the Russians are just using this maybe to educate the Americans. Say, look, you got just sort of like this foaming rabid dog in Ukraine, and you better get it on a tight leash. But I think this education can go different ways too. It may also be kind of a test, for the Russians. They say, can the Russians actually restrain these people? Restrain this foaming at the mouth rabid dog.
The Russians? You mean the Americans restrain Ukraine?
Yeah. I'm sorry. Did I say that? Yeah. Thanks for the correction. Right. The Russians are thinking, can the Americans restrain the Ukrainians? Because if they can't, then what's the point of going ahead with any of these talks? Correct.
Right.
So now we can kind of just shift over to the Black Sea and what's happening there. There were, I think, like 12 and a half hours of negotiations, very extensive negotiations in Riyadh, just a couple of days ago. And in the end, nothing concrete was achieved. There was all this very diplomatic language about many things were discussed. Creative solutions were offered. You know, in other words, nothing was agreed to. It seems to me clear that the Russians are being very firm. They had a bad experience earlier. There was what was called the grain deal in the early months of the war, and that was said. Okay, the Russians will allow Ukraine to use the Black Sea to export grain to the rest of the world. You know, we won't interfere with the shipping. You know, but they can't use those ships to smuggle in arms. And then also we must be allowed to export grain, you know, unhindered. And so, the Europeans and the U.S. had already imposed these sanctions, which made it very difficult, you know, created all kinds of obstacles to the export of grain by Russia. Their agricultural bank was disconnected from SWIFT and so on and so forth. There are all kinds of sanctions. So, you know, part of the deal was that those sanctions were supposed to be lifted, but they never were. And so finally the Russians said, we're out of here. So you have the Russians clearly have the ability to impose a real blockade on Ukraine, but they haven't. They occasionally will attack a ship. You know, mainly it's actually like when it's in the port and it's clear to them that there are a lot of, military equipment, you know, on the ship, you know, being unloaded, and then they will attack it. So sometimes they have damaged ships in that way, and there may be some other cases. But all in all, they've been letting the ships go through. And I think the reason is that a lot of countries are, you know, dependent. Ukraine is still an important grain producer, you know, a much smaller grain producer than Russia is, but it's still one of the world's major grain producers. And there's much of the world, especially the poorest part of the world, that's very dependent on those exports. So they have not imposed a blockade, you know, even though it would make military sense for the Russians. So anyway, this would be an effort to allow for inspections of those ships, you know, so that the Russians can verify that no munitions are being smuggled into Ukraine. And then it also would allow the Russians to export grain unimpeded. You know, that was the idea of the original grain deal, and I think there's an attempt to do that again. And in a statement that the Americans made, they acknowledged these problems. You know, it seemed like they accepted the reasonableness, but they just made this rather vague statement that we will help, like Russia, to have these obstacles removed. I think the problem is probably the Europeans. You know, the Europeans are probably unwilling to do it. So I don't think there's a whole lot of hope that this Black Sea deal, you know, this Black Sea ceasefire will actually be put into effect. And, you know, the other ceasefire, the one on energy infrastructure, is already really have been torn to pieces by the Ukrainian side. You know, that's what we're looking at right now.
You said that maybe the Russians were using this as an opportunity to educate the Americans on how difficult it is to deal with the Ukrainians, that they really have to restrain them. The Ukrainians are the ones that are breaking all these deals. Are the Russians trying to educate the Europeans as well, or are they just the Europeans such a lost cause at this point that they say basically they lump the European leaders in with Ukraine as crazy rabid dogs as well?
I think the latter is true. I think they really have written off the Europeans, with the exception of, you know, again, Hungary and Slovakia at this point. The recent statements by Lavrov, are very much that effect. It's just like the Europeans are nuts, and there's just no point in talking to them right now. But they feel like there is a window of opportunity with the Americans. You know, they, again, like the Americans, not the Americans, but the Russians in general have been much more cautious about the possibility of of a lasting ceasefire or a settlement or, substantive progress in these negotiations. You get statements on the American side, like, from Witkoff and from Trump, that a deal is right around the corner. You don't hear that on the Russian side. And I think the Russians are just being very realistic. They know what they're up against. But they do see benefit in having these talks. Partly, I think, like we're saying, I think we said this even months ago, that it's educational. I think the as a chance for them to really explain their position and open the eyes of the Americans to some of the problems, with Ukraine and Europe. And I think that's what we're getting out of it.
Well, if Ukraine and Europe don't want to play ball, then is peace pretty much impossible? Or will they slowly be educated themselves as the Americans understand and don't want to support the Ukraine regime and the Europeans more and more? Will that just force the Europeans to be like, okay, we can't do this?
Yeah. Well, again, there's just at this point, there's virtually no evidence of any kind of realism on the European side. Maybe I'll offer one exception, and that is, Keir Starmer has been making all these crazy statements. He's trying to be the new Churchill, which he, again, is, well, Macron was going to be the new Napoleon, right? But so he's been talking about, these grandiose plans, the rearming of Europe and the sending of troops to Ukraine and so on and so forth. Well, recently, actually, his own defense department, it came up, stated quite plainly that it was theater. That there just isn't any substance to what Keir Starmer is saying. So you'd see there is a bit of realism there. It's interesting that often you find the realism, the more realistic faction within the military, within the various defense departments. But that's just a small island. In general, these leaders are just, often their fantasy world. And they do seem to be just thoroughly dedicated to preventing peace from breaking out. And they have, very willing accomplices in Ukraine, unfortunately. Now, the Russians, for their part, there are a lot of Russians, the more nationalist bent, that have been afraid that the Russians are going to accept a bad deal, like another Minsk. They're going to allow the West to pull the wool over their eyes once again. But I don't think so. I think, Putin gave a very important speech to, I think it was the Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs. And it was mostly about Ukraine. And what he did is, he's repeated, the conditions that he had set out in June of last year. The four oblasts, Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, Lugansk, plus Crimea, those are Russian territory. And and that's over. That's settled. None of this is negotiable. No NATO, and also no banderism. That's the so-called denazification. All that has been restated consistently. There's no sign that the Russians are budging on this. And in fact, this time, this is the important thing, that he added some new conditions. That he said, okay, we're going to take those four oblasts. But not only that, we need recognition, international recognition from them. The U.S. must recognize them as Russian territory and Ukraine. And if they don't, and we're not going to wait forever, we're only going to give them a relatively brief period of time. We're not going to say, well, maybe 5 years down the road. But, if you don't do this within a brief period of time, we're going on. And we're going on to Odessa and Kharkov. So he said it. We've been wondering about that. There have been hints of that, but this time he laid it out. So he's actually even firmed up the threats. He's not going in the opposite direction. I think, they're obviously allowing the Ukrainians to get away with bloody murder in this energy infrastructure ceasefire. I think that's purposeful. It makes a lot of Russians mad, and I understand that. But I think it is, the Russians' leadership is calculating that this is going to, again, maybe open the eyes of the Americans. There's some reason to be, again, hopeful about these people, about the American negotiators.
Do you think that the U.S. would officially recognize those four oblasts? Would they do that?
I don't know. I think it would be very hard for. I think part of the problem too is, I'm not sure exactly what, but a lot of these agreements require, according to the U.S. Constitution, Senate ratification. and generally by a 2/3 majority. And I don't think that's possible right now. So I think it's, even if the administration goes out on a limb and does it, and that's within the realm of possibility. Again, we've heard these things, encouraging statements, not just one or two, but now, kind of accumulating number of statements that there is kind of a growing understanding within the administration of Russia's position. But, that in the end, they're going to have to, well, first of all, it really would be a firestorm. And especially if Trump just might decide it's not a fight that he wants to fight, but it's hard to predict anything about Trump. But even if he does, decide that, okay, we got to do this, bite the bullet, accept it. This is the only way to end this conflict. I think the Senate will prevent him from actually, officially recognizing those territories.
Yeah, I think it'd be very difficult. I mean, we already hear the screams of capitulation and appeasement and comparing him to Neville Chamberlain all over again. If he does this, you think those screams, those intensify 100-fold.
Right.
And it's interesting they say it needs Senate ratification, because it feels like with the United States, we kind of pick and choose due process, like what requires congressional approval, what requires Senate ratification. Apparently we're allowed to bomb countries and, impose tariffs or do anything like this with executive orders. So I sometimes I wonder, like, do these things even hold things up? I don't know how much of a legitimate process we have in our government anymore. It seems like we're moving slightly more and more towards authoritarianism in a way as well. So
yeah, good point. But the Russians might demand it if they know that really, according to U.S. law, Senate ratification is required. They might demand it because they understand that, okay, well, Trump's term's going to end in 4 years, and who knows who's going to be there. I think there's at least a 50-50 chance it's going to be a Democrat, even though they're so unpopular, because there is a real chance that the economy could go south. And again, people vote their pocketbooks. And then if it was just Trump's word or, an executive order on the part of Trump, that can be easily done, on the first day of the new president's term. So the Russians might demand, even if the U.S. is not willing to abide by its own constitution, the Russians might demand that it do so.
So everything you're saying is telling me that this war is going to continue, that likely the Russians, they didn't give a deadline, right? They didn't say how long until, we need to have some type of international recognition of these roadblocks.
Right. But I think Putin just implied that it's, that it's not going to be, it's relatively urgent. It's something that it needs to be addressed right away, that the Russians just can't wait around definitely for years, it's just, so I don't think he actually set, a deadline, but he implied that, the Russian patience is limited.